It happened so suddenly that I didn't even have time to scream. One gentle nudge against my back, and I was no longer standing on the polished deck of the yacht. I was falling, arms flailing, breath trapped in my chest, until the icy Atlantic swallowed me whole. The shock of the cold cut through me like knives. For a few terrifying seconds, I didn't know which way was up. The water pressed in on me, heavy and merciless, dragging at my dress, my shoes, my every breath. When I finally broke the surface, gasping and choking on salt water. The first thing I saw was the gleaming white yacht drifting farther away. My own son stood on that deck, his arm wrapped around his wife, their silhouettes shrinking as the boat picked up speed. It's hard to describe what it feels like to realize your child, the one you raised, fed, and sacrificed for just left you to die. It wasn't just the cold water that made me shiver. It was the betrayal that froze me to my core. People talk about heartbreak, but betrayal has its own taste. It's bitter, metallic, like pennies on your tongue. I kicked, clawed, and fought against the drag of the ocean, my lungs burning as if the sea wanted to claim me. My mind spun between two thoughts. How could they do this to me? And how am I going to survive long enough to make them regret it? As I treaded water, each breath sharp and painful, 1,000 memories came rushing back, holding my son's hand when he was 5, cheering at his baseball games, staying up late to help him with college applications. All those moments that defined motherhood suddenly felt like lies. Had he always been capable of this? Or had greed twisted him into someone unrecognizable? The waves slapped against my face, forcing me to stay focused, to keep moving. But inside, I was unraveling. In less than a minute, my life had been split into two before the betrayal and after. And the cruelest part of all, just hours earlier, I had believed it would be a perfect day. My son had called me with warmth in his voice, saying he wanted to celebrate my recovery with a private cruise. I dressed carefully, hopeful that maybe, just maybe, this was his way of showing he still cared. I couldn't have known that what began as a sunny, ordinary morning would end with me gasping for air in the middle of the ocean, fighting to stay alive. When people hear the word wealth, they imagine freedom, security, maybe even happiness. What they don't see is how it can twist the people closest to you, turning love into calculation and family into something you can't quite trust anymore. I became a widow 2 years ago. My husband, Robert, had built a successful tech company from nothing, and when he passed, every bit of it shares, real estate, accounts landed on my shoulders. I was left with more than $3 billion in assets, and for a long time, I thought that meant I was safe. But money can't buy companionship. It can't replace the sound of someone breathing beside you at night, or the warmth of a hand reaching for yours at the dinner table. That loneliness was the opening crack in my armor. My son, Daniel, knew it too. He was my only child, my pride, the reason I'd worked so hard to support Robert in building that empire. I wanted nothing more than to believe that after his father's death, he still needed me, not just what I could give him. His wife, Vanessa, was always polished and charming on the surface, though her smiles had a sharpness to them I could never quite name. In the beginning, I convinced myself their invitations were genuine. Brunches, little visits to check in, calls to remind me how much they cared. I clung to those gestures like a starving woman clings to scraps. Looking back, I see them for what they were: rehearsals, performances, carefully timed acts meant to keep me compliant. The first red flag came when Daniel brought up my will. He said probate could be messy, that maybe I should simplify things, just in case. His voice was warm, but underneath it, I felt the tug of expectation. Then Vanessa started dropping hints about my health, how forgetful I seemed lately, how hard surgery must have been on me. They offered to help with paperwork, to manage bills, to take the burden off my shoulders. At the time, it sounded like kindness. I wanted to believe it was kindness. I let Daniel handle more than he should have. I signed forms without reading them as closely as I once would have. I told myself it was temporary, just until I felt stronger. Even when my financial advisor stopped returning calls. Even when I noticed documents piling up that didn't look quite right. I brushed it aside. I told myself, they're my family. They wouldn't hurt me. But unease has a way of growing in silence. Each time Vanessa mentioned dementia, or Daniel pressed about trust funds, I felt my chest tighten. I wanted to dismiss it as my imagination, the paranoia of an aging widow. But somewhere deep down, I knew their smiles didn't reach their eyes anymore. I knew their affection came with an edge. And yet, I stayed quiet. I swallowed my doubts because admitting them out loud meant admitting the unthinkable, that my own child could see me not as a mother, but as an obstacle. That's how I ended up on that yacht. That's how I dressed in my favorite navy dress that morning, clinging to the hope that a celebration cruise was really about family, and not about what they stood to gain by erasing me. What I didn't realize then was that I wasn't walking into a reunion. I was walking into an ambush. The air on that yacht had grown heavier with every passing minute. At first, there had been laughter, champagne, the glimmer of sunlight dancing on the waves. But then, the tone shifted. My son's voice carried that false sweetness I had begun to recognize. And soon the questions came about my will, about the trust, about whether I had considered making things easier for everyone. Vanessa chimed in with her polished confidence, her words sharper than the sea breeze, pointing out how forgetful I had been, how fragile I seemed after surgery. They spoke as if I wasn't fully present, as if my mind had already slipped away. And then it became clear they were building a case against me, not for me. A case that painted me as incompetent, a burden, someone better off stepping aside. I remember the chill that ran down my spine when I realized what they were doing. It wasn't just talk anymore. It was strategy. I looked at them, my own blood, and I saw strangers plotting how to erase me while smiling into their champagne glasses. When I stood to demand they take me back to shore, the mask fell away. Their affection vanished, replaced by cold calculation. Vanessa's eyes flickered with something darker than hatred. It was greed without limits. She moved behind me with a quiet ease, and before I could steady myself, I felt that shove, a gentle push, precise, enough to send me off balance. The ocean swallowed me whole. The cold struck like fire, shocking my system, dragging me down as the weight of my dress and shoes pulled at me. Panic surged. My lungs screamed for air. I fought upward, breaking the surface, gasping, only to see the yacht turning, moving away, its engines humming. My son's figure shrinking as he raised a hand to his forehead, pretending to shield his eyes, pretending to search. But I knew. They weren't looking for me. They were leaving me. Those next moments were a blur of survival, kicking, clawing, choking on salt water as the current dragged me farther from the shore. My arms ached. My chest burned, and the betrayal burned even hotter. This wasn't just about inheritance. This was about erasing me completely. And then, against the vast emptiness, I spotted a fishing boat, rough, weathered, out of place against the luxury yacht that had abandoned me. Strong hands pulled me aboard, wrapping me in a blanket that smelled of sea and oil. A stranger's voice asked what happened, but my words stumbled, trembling, half drowned. All I could think was how kindness came from strangers, while cruelty came from my own flesh and blood. As the boat turned toward the harbor, a new thought pierced through the fog. In my mind, I couldn't let anyone know I had survived not yet. If my son and his wife believed I was gone, they would reveal their true plans, and I needed to see exactly how far they were willing to go. In that moment, shivering under a borrowed blanket, I made my choice. I would disappear on purpose. I would let them think they had won. And then, when the time was right, I would come back not as a victim, but as the one holding the truth. For the first time in my life, I understood what it felt like to be invisible. The world thought I was dead. My son and daughter-in-law played the grieving family while I hid in the shadows, watching. It was terrifying, but it also gave me something I hadn't had in years: perspective. When people think you're gone, they show their true faces. I stayed at a small bed and breakfast owned by a woman named Mrs. Chen. She didn't ask many questions, and I was grateful for that. There's a certain kind of kindness that doesn't need explanations. It just gives you a warm meal and a safe bed. Her quiet support gave me enough strength to start piecing things together. I knew I couldn't stay hidden forever. To fight back, I needed evidence. So one night, after darkness settled across the city, I went back to the house I had once called home. My key still fit the back door. Slipping inside felt like stepping into a life that wasn't mine anymore. Everything was cleaner, sharper, colder. The furniture had changed, but the walls remembered me. I moved carefully through the rooms, flashlight low, heart pounding like a drum. In Robert's old study, I found what I had been hoping for and dreading. Papers covered the desk, financial statements, legal documents, and then I saw it a binder labeled Project Margaret. My hands shook as I flipped through the pages. It was all their fabricated medical notes about memory loss, staged photographs meant to make me look confused, records of medication switches I hadn't authorized. They had spent months, maybe longer, creating the illusion that I was losing my mind. Every incident of forgetfulness had been documented, every stumble exaggerated, all building toward one conclusion: that I was incompetent. But it didn't stop there. Among the files, I found another set of documents that made my blood run cold, a forged version of my will, one that left everything to Daniel and included provisions for future children. Future children that, as far as I knew, didn't exist. That was when I heard it, the faint cry of a baby echoing through the halls. A baby. I froze, unable to move for several seconds. Daniel and Vanessa had never mentioned having children. When I saw the nursery, complete with expensive equipment and a crib lined with designer blankets, I realized just how deep this went. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. I slipped out before they returned, but I couldn't shake the sound of that baby's cry. Back at the inn, I confided in Mrs. Chen, who introduced me to someone she trusted, a private investigator named Danny Crawford. Danny was sharp, cautious, and more importantly, willing to believe me when most people would have dismissed me as paranoid. Together, we started to dig deeper. Danny traced financial transactions and discovered large cash withdrawals linked to a medical facility that specialized in surrogacy. My stomach dropped when he showed me the paperwork. Daniel and Vanessa had arranged for a baby months before, but the mother listed a girl named Sarah Collins was only 17. She had died during childbirth, though the medical notes claimed it was from complications. I didn't need anyone to spell it out for me. A healthy teenager doesn't just collapse in labor without warning. This wasn't bad luck. This was orchestrated. They had bought themselves an heir and erased the girl who carried him. The weight of it hit me harder than the ocean ever had. My betrayal wasn't just personal anymore. This was part of something larger, darker, more calculated than I had imagined. My son and his wife weren't acting alone. They were part of a network that preyed on the vulnerable, the elderly, the powerless, the unseen. But in their arrogance, they had overlooked one thing: me. I was still alive, and with every document we uncovered, with every layer of deceit we pulled back, my fear was slowly turning into something else. Resolve. I no longer wanted just to survive. I wanted the truth exposed, no matter how dangerous it became. The baby's cry still echoed in my memory, haunting me. And I knew then this wasn't just about protecting my fortune anymore. It was about saving a child from being raised in the arms of people who had already proven capable of murder. The game had shifted. It was no longer about me being their victim. It was about me becoming their reckoning. The day of my funeral, I stood hidden at the edge of the cemetery, watching my own son and daughter-in-law dressed in black, their faces arranged into masks of grief. They accepted condolences, wiped fake tears, and played the part of the heartbroken family. I watched them bury an empty casket with my name carved into it, and in that moment, I decided exactly how I wanted to make my return. Not quietly, not privately, but in a way that would shake them to their core. 2 days later, when they returned from another meeting with their lawyer, they walked into the living room of the house I had once owned and found me sitting in my favorite armchair, the one Robert had bought me on our 20th anniversary. I had chosen that spot carefully. I wanted my presence to be the first thing they saw when they opened the door. The look on their faces was worth every cold, sleepless night I had spent planning. Vanessa's scream cut through the air like glass shattering. Daniel froze, keys still in his hand, his mouth open, his skin turning pale. For a long moment, neither of them moved, as if hoping I was a ghost that would vanish if they blinked hard enough. But I was no ghost. I was very much alive. Calmly, I told them I had seen enough of their charade, that the performance at the funeral might have fooled the neighbors, but it hadn't fooled me. I held up the folder of documents I had collected: the forged will, the staged medical notes, the timeline of their so-called Project Margaret. My voice was steady, almost gentle, but every word landed like a hammer. I could see it in Daniel's eyes: panic, denial, calculation, all crashing together. Vanessa, however, tried to recover quickly, her smile twitching into place, her tone sharp and dismissive. But the mask slipped as I laid each piece of evidence on the coffee table between us, one after another, until the pile was undeniable. And then came the part they hadn't expected. The baby's caretaker stepped into the room, holding the child they had tried to pass off as their own. That tiny life, swaddled in soft blankets, was the one thing they couldn't explain away. My heart clenched as I looked at him. but my voice grew stronger. I told them I knew about Sarah Collins. I knew about the surrogacy, the lies, the teenage girl who hadn't survived to tell her story. For the first time that day, both Daniel and Vanessa were silent, truly silent. And in that silence, I realized something I no longer feared them. I was no longer the vulnerable widow they thought they could push aside. I had walked through betrayal, through the ocean, through their manufactured death. And now I was standing in my own living room, alive, armed with the truth, and completely in control. They had thought burying me was the end of the story, but they were wrong. It was only the beginning. For weeks, I had thought Daniel and Vanessa were the masterminds, but as the evidence piled up, the picture became clearer. They were pawns. The real architect of my downfall was someone far more dangerous, a lawyer named Miranda Torres. She specialized in family transitions, as she called them. In truth, she orchestrated inheritances by manufacturing incompetence, pushing grieving relatives into sudden wealth, and making inconvenient elders disappear. Knowing her reach terrified me. But if I wanted to end this nightmare, I had to face her. And this time, I wouldn't be walking in alone. With the FBI's guidance, we set the trap. They wired my home with hidden microphones and cameras. My job was simple, and yet it chilled me sit down across from the woman who had nearly orchestrated my murder, and let her talk. When she arrived, she was smaller than I imagined. Polished, calm, briefcase in hand. She looked like any other professional in Boston. That's what made her so dangerous. She carried herself with the confidence of someone who had gotten away with this dozens of times before. As we sat face to face, she spoke in careful, soothing tones, like a doctor explaining a diagnosis. She framed it as helping families move forward. She even tried to justify the deaths, painting them as acts of mercy. With every word, my stomach turned, but I kept my expression steady, nodding, letting her believe I was willing to negotiate. Then she slipped. She began to list numbers cases she had resolved. 37 people, 37 lives she spoke of as if they were line items in an accounting ledger. In that moment, I no longer saw her as just my enemy. She was a predator who had turned entire families into accomplices. And then it happened. The front door burst open, followed by the thunder of boots. FBI agents swarmed the room, voices sharp and commanding. In seconds, Miranda was pinned to the ground, her briefcase spilling across the floor, papers scattering like broken wings. Daniel and Vanessa sat frozen, pale as ghosts, as their supposed ally was read her rights. Relief crashed over me like a wave. For the first time since that cold morning on the yacht, I felt safe. Justice had arrived, not in whispers, but in a storm. And yet, as I looked at my son's downcast face, I realized the battle was only half over. The bigger enemy was gone, but the wounds within my own family would take far longer to heal. 5 years have passed since that night when the FBI carried Miranda Torres away in handcuffs. Justice was slow, but it came. She will spend the rest of her life behind bars, and with her arrest, dozens of other families finally learned the truth about the accidents that had stolen their loved ones. Daniel and Vanessa were convicted too. They made their choices, and they will live with the consequences for decades. But this story isn't just about punishment. It's also about what came after. The baby, the one they tried to use as a pawn, became my grandson in every way that matters. I named him Robert, after his grandfather. and Sarah, after the young mother who never got the chance to raise him. He's growing up healthy, curious, and so full of life. Every time I look into his eyes, I feel both the weight of what was lost and the hope of what's been saved. I've promised him he will always know the truth about where he came from. Love and honesty will be the foundation of his life, not lies and greed. As for me, I finally found peace. I learned that blood is not what makes a family. Family is the people who choose to love you, protect you, and stand with you when the storm hits. Sometimes those people are strangers who pull you from the ocean or give you a place to hide when the world turns against you. If you take one thing from my story, let it be this family is chosen every day through love, not inherited by blood or obligation. Thank you for listening. If my story resonated with you, I'd love to hear yours. Share your thoughts in the comments, and if you believe in stories that remind us of resilience and love, don't forget to like and share. Your voice matters.